Located in Rockville, Maryland, is St. Mary's Church, which is a historic Catholic church that was canonically established in 1813. It has expanded over the years, but it remains a thriving Catholic parish with its own school. St. Mary's Church has a graveyard. Near the entrance is its memorial to the unknown slaves who were buried throughout the Archdiocese of Washington. The graveyard itself is small, but it's notable for having one grave that should be of interest to literary fans. This graveyard is the final resting place of F. Scott Fitzgerald, his wife Zelda Fitzgerald, and their daughter Frances Scott Fitzgerald Smith, who was nicknamed Scottie. F. Scott Fitzgerald was born in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1896. He was named Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald after a distant cousin, Francis Scott Key, who wrote a poem during the War of 1812 that later became the lyrics to the national anthem of the United States, the Star-Spangled Banner. His paternal grandparents operated a farm right outside of Rockville, and his father was born and raised on that farm until he decided to move west to St. Paul. When Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald decided to become a writer, he shortened his name to F. Scott Fitzgerald. He gained fame as a jazz age writer of the 1920s, who is best known for writing novels about the excesses of that era, such as The Beautiful and the Damned, Tender is the Night, and The Great Gatsby. F. Scott married Zelda, a socialite from a wealthy family in Montgomery, Alabama. Her father was a Reconstruction-era Alabama politician and Alabama Supreme Court judge named Anthony Dickinson Sayre, a notorious white supremacist who was instrumental in initiating the segregationist Jim Crow laws in Alabama. Zelda's looks initially gained her public attention as a quintessential flapper girl. She wanted to be known more than just being F. Scott Fitzgerald's wife. She wanted a career of her own where she would be as successful as her husband. She published her own jazz-age novel called Save Me the Waltz, but that one was nowhere near as successful as her husband's books, although that novel has since gained its own fans several decades after her death. She also attempted careers as a playwright and a ballerina, but they were short-lived as well. She subsequently became a painter who created works of art using watercolor and gouache, but she was never taken seriously as an artist in her lifetime. F. Scott and Zelda were the quintessential celebrity power couple similar to Jay-Z and Beyonce, yet they were just as dysfunctional and self-destructive as later celebrity couples like Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love. F. Scott and Zelda were thrown out of 2 New York hotels for disturbing other guests. They once jumped into the water fountain outside of the Plaza Hotel while they were fully dressed. They frequently hired taxicabs and rode on a hood. One evening, they got drunk, then they visited a county morgue where they inspected unidentified corpses. During another drunken incident, Zelda insisted on sleeping in a dog kennel. Their attention-getting partying ways began to severely affect their health. Zelda developed severe mental health issues, which came to a head during a car trip to Paris along the mountainous roads of the Grand Corniche, when Zelda seized the car's steering wheel and attempted to kill herself, her husband, and their 9-year-old daughter. That incident resulted in her spending the last years of her life shifting between various mental institutions in Europe and the United States. She was originally diagnosed as having schizophrenia, but she would later be diagnosed posthumously as having bipolar disorder. F. Scott Fitzgerald became an alcoholic, which undermined his health by the late 1930s. His popularity as a jazz-age novelist had faded when the Great Depression began, which started a vicious cycle where his declining career and his wife's mental health led to him drinking, while his drinking further accelerated his decline in his career and his marriage. After Zelda was committed to the first of many mental hospitals, F. Scott would remain legally married to Zelda while he became involved with other women, most notably gossip columnist Sheila Graham. By 1939, F. Scott had managed to achieve sobriety, only to suddenly die a year later in 1940 at the age of 44 of a heart attack stemming from his poor health, which had never fully recovered from his alcoholism. While he left no instructions for his burial other than he wanted the cheapest funeral possible, it was his wife Zelda, who was in a mental hospital in North Carolina at the time, who insisted that he should be buried at St. Mary's Church in Rockville because that was where various Fitzgerald family members were buried, including his parents. However, the church denied the request because F. Scott hadn't been attending Mass. There was also his reputation as a womanizing alcoholic party animal. Instead, F. Scott Fitzgerald was buried at the nearby Rockville Cemetery in a Protestant ceremony. Zelda would continue to be shuttled around between various mental hospitals until she ended up at one in Asheville, North Carolina, where in 1948 a fire broke out in the hospital kitchen. Zelda was so heavily sedated that she was unable to flee, and she died at the age of 47. She would be buried alongside her husband at the Rockville Cemetery. The couple only had one child, a daughter named Frances Scott Fitzgerald, who was nicknamed Scottie. Despite the turbulence surrounding her parents, Scottie never had any complaints about either parent. She was quoted as saying, "They were always circumspect around me. I was unaware of all the drinking that was going on. I was very well taken care of, and I was never neglected. I didn't consider it a difficult childhood at all. In fact, it was a wonderful childhood." She even tried to show the positive aspects of her parents when she posed for a photo that was published in the February 1959 issue of Life magazine, where she showed her children the paper dolls that her mother Zelda made for her when she was a child. The fact that she was raised primarily by nannies probably had helped with her having positive childhood memories of her parents despite their personal problems. It probably also helped that at the age of 15, she was sent to a fashionable boarding school where her father's agent, Harold Ober, and his wife Anne became her surrogate parents who visited her at school, and she stayed with them during school holidays. 17 months before her graduation from Vassar College, her father died. By the age of 26, both of her parents were dead. She became a writer, just like both of her parents, but she focused more on writing for publications like The New Yorker, where she wrote nightclub reviews and published the occasional short story fiction. In 1943, she married Samuel Jackson Lanham before he shipped off to serve in World War II. He returned to the U.S. after the war ended, and the couple moved to Washington, D.C., where he became a prominent lawyer, and the couple became popular hosts in Washington society in the 1950s and 1960s. Scottie wrote and directed musical comedies about the Washington social scene that were performed annually to benefit the Multiple Sclerosis Society of Washington, and one of them was even considered for a Broadway run. She became involved in Democratic politics, and she wrote for a publication of the Democratic National Committee, as well as being a writer for Al A. Stevenson when he ran for president against Dwight Eisenhower in 1956. She also had 4 children during the marriage. In 1967, she divorced her husband and married Clinton Grover Smith. In 1973, she separated from her second husband, and she moved from Washington, D.C. to her mother's hometown of Montgomery, Alabama, where she lived for the rest of her life. She researched her family's roots, only to be horrified when she learned that her grandfather, Anthony Dickinson Sayre, was a white supremacist who had authored the notorious 1893 Sayre Act, which disenfranchised blacks and poor whites of the right to vote, and which also ushered in the Jim Crow laws in that state. Scottie felt so embarrassed and guilty over learning that fact that she spent the remainder of her life devoting herself to voter outreach programs in Alabama, especially to people of color. Compared to both of her parents, Scottie lived a relatively drama-free life, aside from her 2 divorces and the fact that her 27-year-old son committed suicide in 1973. Scottie spent her later years trying to rehabilitate her parents' image, as various biographers painted a portrait of F. Scott as a domineering husband who drove Zelda insane, while Zelda's mental instability fueled F. Scott's alcoholism. She said that her father was far from being domineering and had encouraged her mother to try playwriting and painting. She denied that her father caused her mother's mental health problems, and she also denied that her mother drove her father to drink. Scottie died of throat cancer in Montgomery in 1986 at the age of 64. Before she died, she told her children that she wished she had quit smoking cigarettes years earlier. In 1975, 11 years before Scottie's death, the members of the Rockville Women's Club noticed that the Fitzgerald's grave at Rockville Cemetery was deteriorating. They began to speak with the surviving members of F. Scott's family, including Scottie, only to learn that they had originally wanted to bury him at St. Mary's Church, but they were denied. Scottie contacted St. Mary's Church, and this time, the church decided to allow F. Scott and Zelda to be reburied in their cemetery. After her death, Scottie was buried next to her parents at that same cemetery. At the head of the plot is a headstone that has the names of F. Scott and Zelda, along with their dates of birth and death. In front of the headstone is a concrete slab that has this quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald's most famous novel, The Great Gatsby. "So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past." Sometimes the slab will either have tiny flowers left on it or have nothing at all. Other times you'll see items left behind by other visitors, such as these pictures I took during a previous visit back in 2015 when someone left pens, coins, flowers, a tiny pumpkin, and a couple of empty gin bottles. Scottie is buried at the foot of her parents' grave under the name Frances Scott Fitzgerald Smith, along with the inscription, "Loving mother of Thomas Addison, Eleanor Ann, Samuel Jackson Jr., Cecilia Scott Lanham." F. Scott, Zelda, and Scottie are now buried near F. Scott's father, Edward, and his mother, Mary. They are also buried near an assortment of other Fitzgerald family members, although I wasn't able to figure out if they were siblings, aunts, uncles, grandparents, or cousins. There is even a flat marker that only has the Fitzgerald surname. I assume that earlier Fitzgerald ancestors are buried there, and they were probably too poor at the time to afford an actual headstone. St. Mary's Church is located at 520 Veers Mill Road in Rockville, Maryland. The graveyard is open to the general public during daylight hours, and it is small enough to easily find the Fitzgerald family graves. The best time to visit are on Saturday afternoon, Sunday afternoon, and on the weekdays during the summer when there is no scheduled mass being held and school is not in session.